All right, finding the midpoint with something like these guys, we don't actually have it on a graph. There are a couple ways we can do this. One, and probably the easiest way to do this, is to grab some graph paper and actually plot these points. All right, if you grab some graph paper and actually plot these points, now it's no different from the examples we've been doing. And once you have them plotted, you just have to count halfway up, halfway over, or halfway down, halfway over, and you'll be at the midpoint, okay? So that's one option. The second option is you could kind of look at these individually on number lines. You could say, hey, something like between the 7 and the 3, if I put these on a number line, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, you could find the halfway point between the 3 and the 7 on this number line, and that'll give you the halfway point for the 7 and the 3. And so when you look at that, that's a 5. And so the midpoint here would be 5, comma. Well, now I'd have to do a separate number line for the second set of values. So let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so once again, if I wanted the midpoint between 1 and 5 this time, well, halfway in between there, that's a 3, okay? So that's one option, is you can kind of do it on a number line if you don't feel like grabbing graph paper. And really, that's the same thing as what we do on the graph paper, but it saves us from having to get actual graph paper. You can do each of these individually on a number line, and it mimics the same thing. Okay, so that's option one. Option two is you could find the distance between 7 and 3 as 4 by subtracting and always using the positive value. Same thing with the 5 and the 1. And then you could realize that, okay, if the distance is 4, I have to go halfway, which is 2. But then it becomes really tough in terms of, do you count down from the 7 or up from the 3? Students get really confused there. So that's one option. And if that makes sense to you, you can do it that way. That's just using logic to kind of come up with this, okay? That's not the method I'm going to recommend, all right? But that is another option. And so the third option here, one of the easiest ways to find the middle value of two things is to simply find the average. All right, when I do averages, remember, average is when you add up the values and divide by how many values you have, okay? And so like if I get a 50% on my first test and 100% on my second test, my average, if I add together and divide by 2, is a 75%. And that 75 is exactly halfway in between the 50 and the 100, okay? Whenever we do the average with only two values, I automatically get the value that's exactly halfway in between, all right? And so for this particular example, if I were to take the 7 and the 3 and find the average, let's see, I just do the 7 and the 3 added together, and I divide by how many values I'm adding, which is 2. And watch what happens. I get 10 divided by 2, which is a 5. And that's my first value right here, okay? The average is exactly halfway in between. If I did the same thing with the 5 and the 1, ready? Let's find the average, 5 plus 1. And then I'm going to divide that by 2 because I'm adding two values. And when I do that, I get 6 divided by 2, which is 3. And look at that. That's my second value, okay? So one of the easiest ways mathematically to find the midpoint is to just find the average of the values. Whenever I have two values and I find the average, I get what's exactly halfway in between, okay? If I look at the next one, I'm just going to do this using that little shortcut using the average thing. If you don't feel comfortable with that, go ahead and plot these on a graph and count halfway up and halfway over. Or plot each of these individually on number lines and find the midpoint, okay? Find the halfway point. So if I do the average thing for this one, and the reason I like the average for something like this is because as soon as we start dealing with positive and negative numbers, those number lines get really big. Okay, so it's really easy just to say, hey, let's do 8 plus the negative 4, and then divide by 2. Let's find the average of these two values. So that's 4 over 2, which is a 2. And then I could do the same thing with the next set of values, the negative 2 and the 0. Just find the average. I add them together and divide by 2. So that's negative 2 divided by 2, which is a negative 1. And so when I found the average, the values I got were a 2 and a negative 1, and that's my new ordered pair. Okay? And really, that method of finding the average is where our midpoint formula comes from. I didn't show you the midpoint formula. If that's something you want to go look up and memorize, go for it, okay? And if you want to use that on the test, that's fine. But you can use the midpoint formula. I don't expect you to memorize that, so write it down and use it whenever you need it. But the midpoint formula is essentially just finding the average, okay? The average gives us the middle of the two values, okay?